following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and it's my privilege to introduce another episode of Package Tourist in the Magical Mystery Tour called Life with your host, Mathew DiBiase, who tonight will be interviewing author and sports historian Tommy Phillips, who will be discussing his literary career.
Thank you, Ralph. Tonight, I will be interviewing my dear friend and fellow sports author, Tommy Phillips. Mr. Phillips is a very busy and prolific author. During the past 2 years, he has published 4 books. The first, Nifty 90s, the story of an amazing decade in pro football history, chronicles the NFL during the 1990s. His second work, co-authored with Matt Johnson, Packers versus 49ers, a golden rivalry, delves into the obscure rivalry between the Green Bay Packers and the San Francisco 49ers. Tommy's third release, Tribute to Troy, the stories of USC's bowl victories, is a loving tribute to the USC Trojans when they were one of the greatest college football programs in America and how they performed in bowl game competition. His latest release, Sundays at the Masters, From Jack to Tiger, is an exciting recitation of some of the greatest and most dramatic final rounds in the history of the Masters tournament. Tommy, what inspired you to become a writer?
From a very young age, I was always interested in writing, and I thought I wrote my own book whenever I was like 6 years old. I wrote a 40-page book that was about Super Mario Brothers, and over time I got interested in sports writing, and eventually I actually had a dream about writing a football book a few years ago, and that turned into the Nifty 90s book.
Okay, please tell us how your first book, Nifty 90s, came about. Okay, how did that develop?
Well, I came up with a few ideas for chapters. I thought I would do, maybe some big playoff games, some Super Bowls I would talk about, and then I'd have some top 10 lists. And it started there, and then as time went on, I added more and more to it. And eventually I was like, you know what? I should make this as comprehensive as anything that's ever been put out. So I decided that I was going to review all the playoff games of the decade and 100 regular season games. So that's what I went to do, and it took about 2 years to write, maybe a little more.
Why did you select the 1990s? What was it about that decade as opposed to other decades in NFL history? Why did you select the 1990s?
The 1990s I've always felt was the perfect balance in football between newer passing methods and still enough defense of the old days. I feel like as soon as we got to the 2000s, the game became too much of a passing game and just not enough defense. But of course, if you go back farther, you'll go back into a time whenever there is very little passing and just running game, and 90s seem to be a perfect balance between the two.
Now, I had the honor of going through your book, and I was just stunned by how absolutely comprehensive it is, and you would go into an incredibly fine detail. Based on your research, who do you think was the greatest NFL player of the 1990s as part of your research, your conclusions based on your research?
Yeah, I would have to go with Emmitt Smith. I know it's tough to go against Jerry Rice or a quarterback, but Emmitt Smith was the key to the Cowboys winning those 3 Super Bowls. The entire offense ran through him, and it seemed that just every game that I watched featuring him, that he would just take over games. And I could not think of any other player who had more effect on how well their team did during the decade, especially given that he won 3 Super Bowls. You know, Jerry Rice, amazing numbers, but only won 1.
Okay. Who do you think was the greatest coach of the 1990s? Because I know there was one sector where you actually did that. You came up with a system, you know, and you picked out the coaches. Who was the greatest coach of the 90s based on your research?
Yeah, I picked Jimmy Johnson because he took a Dallas Cowboys team that was left for dead, and they were 3-13 in 1988. His first year, they went 1-15 because he was rebuilding, and by 1990, he already had them within 1 game of a playoff berth. Then he made the playoffs in 91, and then the Cowboys were one of the most dominant teams in 92 and 93, won back-to-back Super Bowls, and he was just unbeatable. And then, of course, the whole fallout with Jerry Jones ended up costing him his job, and then he resurfaced with the Dolphins and still did pretty well with the Dolphins. But his work with the Cowboys, I thought, was just it was better than anyone else had during the decade.
Tommy, a little hypothetical question. Let's say Jerry Jones had not let his ego get in the way and he had basically let Jimmy Johnson alone. Do you think that Cowboys dynasty could have sustained itself, after the Super Bowl 31, in other words, add on more wins had Johnson remained at the helm? What is your conclusion based on your research?
Yeah, the funny thing is that I love Jimmy Johnson, but I'm glad he wasn't around, because if he had been around, the Packers may never have won Super Bowl 31. The Cowboys, even in the Packers' best season, were able to beat them. And I think if Jimmy Johnson stays, the Cowboys maybe win 4 or 5 Super Bowls in the decade. They may have been better than anything we've ever seen, because he just had such a good handle on developing talent and finding the right players. He probably would have won 4 or 5 Super Bowls had the whole fallout with Jerry Jones not happened. And if I were a Cowboys fan, I'd still be regretting it.
Didn't Jimmy Johnson revolutionize drafting as well? Because wasn't he the first one who would jockey for position in terms of, getting the players that he wanted? In other words, aggressive training on draft day just to get a certain specific draft pick, either moving up or down the draft chart. Wasn't he the one who revolutionized that, Tommy?
Yeah, he came up with the system, the point system, so to speak, where each draft pick had a certain amount of points, and then he would make trades, and whenever he'd make a trade, he'd look to see which one would give him the most points, and that caught on around the NFL to the point where now obviously everyone doesn't use the exact same point system, but it's that kind of system that has helped future general managers come up with ways to, if they could make a fair trade. And he did revolutionize the way people looked at the draft.
Tommy, I want to let you in on something. In my second book, The Art of the Dealers, the NHL's Greatest General Managers, one of the GMs I featured was Dean Lombardi, who used to be the general manager of the LA Kings. He adopted Jimmy. He told me flat out, I got him on tape telling me he copped it right straight from Jimmy Johnson, that aggressive jockeying for position. in the draft. So not just in football, but also in NHL. And he helped the Kings win 2 Stanley Cups in the 2010s, using Jimmy Johnson's drafting techniques. Getting back, now you mentioned you're a Packers fan. Now, doing some background research, now you grew up in the greater Pittsburgh area, and yet you describe yourself as a Green Bay Packers fan. How did that come about, Tommy?
It's kind of crazy. Basically, 1994, the Steelers ended up one game short of the Super Bowl, and during the off season, I had never really watched football before the 1994 playoffs. So as a kid, I was trying to pick my favorite team. So I got out those little helmets from the quarter machines at Kmart or wherever, and I was able to collect them all, and I set them up in a line, and then I made 5 of them that I said I was going to choose from. So I picked out the Packers, the Jets, the Raiders, the Rams, and the Steelers, I think. And then I read this book. I had this book because I was borrowing books from the library, and I had a book where it was the 80s, where Joe Klecko was sacking Lynn Dickey of the Packers. And I kind of felt bad for the Packers because they had been so bad in the 80s. So that's why I chose them. And little did I know that they would have one of their most successful 3-year runs right after I chose them as my favorite team.
What are your memories of that Green Bay Packers team of the 90s? I mean, you had Mike Holmgren, who became a coaching legend in his own right. You had Brett Favre. Who were the other key players on that Packers dynasty that you recall?
Yeah, Reggie White obviously is number one besides Favre because on defense he completely changed everything about it. By him coming to Green Bay, he caused so many other players to want to come to Green Bay. And, of course, he was just unstoppable when it came to sacking the quarterback. Leroy Butler, I think, deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, and hopefully he gets the call in a couple of weeks. But he, at the safety position, was not just someone who would get interceptions, but he was also good at blitzing. And the Packers had a 2-headed running attack with Edgar Bennett and Dorsey Levens, and those two had such a good way of playing off each other that whenever one came out, the other one came in, and the offense functioned just as well. And obviously, the receivers, Brett Favre was able to turn these receivers into superstars. He did it with Sterling Sharp. Now, obviously, Sterling Sharp is very talented, and unfortunately, he got injured. But then Favre was able to make Robert Brooks and Antonio Freeman into superstars. And then, of course, the 1996 season, Desmond Howard was just unstoppable as a punt and kick returner.
What was it that made Mike Holmgren the great coach that he is and was?
That's a good question. I just think he had a very good way of dealing with people, and he may not have been the best at scheming or coming up with things. I mean, a lot of his ideas he took from Bill Walsh, but I think he was just able to manage the personalities pretty well, especially Brett Favre, because Favre had a reputation of being a party guy and not really caring, when he was in Atlanta. And whenever he came to Green Bay, Holmgren was able to rein him in and turn him into the superstar that he was. And I feel that Holmgren was able to balance things amongst those big personalities in the locker room, such as like Andre Rison, and able to get the best out of them.
So you're saying he was much better as a psychologist than than an X's and O's guy? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying he was bad at scheming. I'm just saying that his philosophies on football, there was really nothing new about it. It was basically Bill Walsh's system that he brought to Green Bay, and but the way he was able to get the personalities to fit together and turn that into a juggernaut of a team, that's what I'm most impressed about him.
How did your second book, Packers versus 49ers, come about?
Well, the co-author, Matt Johnson, he is a radio host and a newspaper writer in the Mariposa, California area, and he must have bought my book, and then he Googled my name and found me on Facebook. We became friends, and then since he's a 49ers fan, he said, why don't we make a book together where we talk about the Packers and the 49ers and the games they played against each other. So I did a whole lot of painstaking research of some of these really obscure Packers and 49ers games of like the 1950s. And I had never realized that in the 50s and 60s, the Packers and 49ers played each other twice every year. So they actually had more of a rivalry than I'd ever known. And he was able to give a perspective on the 49ers. I was able to give a perspective on the Packers. And we put that together, and I'm sure he sold more copies than me because he lives in 49ers territory. I don't live anywhere close to Packers territory, but it was very fun to write.
You know, it's interesting. Doing my own personal research, even during the Lombardi era, there were some times when the Packers lost to the 49ers. I noticed that, always trouble. Whenever the Packers went out to the West Coast, they always had trouble with either the Rams or the 49ers, or sometimes both. I think one of their two losses in '66 was against the Niners. Is that correct? They lost in a squeaker, if I recall correctly. Yeah. I mean, Lombardi had a little bit of his troubles, even when the 49ers were not exactly world beaters, in the 60s. I mean, they were kind of mediocre under Jack Christensen and all of that. But, he had some troubles, the Green Bay. I mean, did you discover that as well? I mean, am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah. And what I found, it was very cyclical. It was a thing where the 49ers would dominate for a while, and then the Packers would dominate for a while, and they went back and forth. And obviously there were some big upsets in the 60s. And then in the 70s, they didn't really play that much. Obviously, in the 80s, the 49ers dominated. And then once Holmgren came to Green Bay and brought his extensive knowledge of the 49ers, he was able to completely dominate the 49ers. And the Packers won almost every game against the 49ers except for the famous Terrell Owens game, and they won almost every game for a good 10 years. And now the 49ers have gotten the best of that rivalry in recent years.
What is your personal take on last Sunday's loss by the Packers to the 49ers? I figured that was a hammer blow to you. What is your analysis of that game?
Yeah, it was very disappointing, and certainly I started to wonder if Aaron Rodgers is ever going to get back to the Super Bowl. But at the same time, no one expected the team to be this good in Matt LaFleur's first year. as head coach. They made some really good strides forward from being 6-9-1 to now being 13-3 and winning a playoff game. So I think there's a lot to build on for the future. The only problem really I see is Aaron Rodgers getting older and his skills declining, and that's obviously the defense too, but I think the defense can be improved easier than it will be to improve the quarterback play, because let's face it, Aaron Rodgers had some great stats in that game, but he came up short whenever the team needed him the most. The team really needed him to just match the 49ers for score, and then hope they got things figured out afterward. But since he couldn't even get the Packers any points, then it just got out of control, and then they had no chance. And then the 49ers were able to run the ball at will, and the 49ers wouldn't have been able to run the ball on every play had the Packers scored some in the first half and at least made a game of it. So I think Rodgers deserves more blame than he gets. At the same time, he is my favorite player, so I really want to see him go to another Super Bowl, and hopefully they make some good draft picks and are able to get the help they need to make it there.
I had this, following the Packers this season, I had the impression a lot of the pundits were thinking that what the Packers were doing was highly improbable, that sooner or later the bubble was going to burst, and yet against all odds, they took the divisional title. And tell me if you agree with this theory that I've been formulating. The fact was, maybe they weren't a total package, but in many ways the Packers were a happy team. They were playing happy. They were, in other words, they weren't happy under the final years of Mike McCarthy. They were, it was not a happy locker room. It was not a happy team. But under LaFleur, all of a sudden, the windows were open. The windows were open, and the air was coming in, and all of a sudden, Aaron Rodgers was feeling happy, and everyone else was feeling happy, and they were playing loose, and that probably psychologically helped with the turnaround. Do you agree with that? Do you think it was morale-wise that helped with the turnaround?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that most of the fans have noticed, that once they brought in Zadarius Smith from free agency, and with him Preston Smith and Adrian Amos, those guys changed the locker room, changed the culture, and it became a lot more positive around there. Matt LaFleur was the right guy at the right time. I don't think McCarthy is a bad coach by any means. And, in fact, I was looking forward to him going to the AFC, because I thought if he joined a team like the Browns, I'd probably cheer for them. Well, I can't cheer for the Cowboys. But on the Packers side, the entire locker room was different, and instead of having these really tense press conferences that happened last year, everything was loose and relaxed this year, and I think that's a big reason why they were able to do so well.
Yeah, now your third book covers the USC. Since your third book covers the USC Trojans, is it accurate for me to guess that, are you a USC fan by any chance when it comes to college football? Are you?
Yeah. I'm half and half Penn State and USC, because I went to Penn State Erie for my undergraduate, and then for my graduate I went to USC. And now I didn't finish my graduate at USC. I ended up just becoming too homesick from Los Angeles to Pittsburgh, and as a result I had to go back home. But because I went there, I became a fan of everything Trojans, and I wanted to do a book about them. because I respected their football program so much. And eventually I was able to see the Rose Bowl between Penn State and USC a few years back. And my dad and I flew out to Los Angeles and were able to see the Rose Bowl. And that was an incredible experience.
In your opinion, based on your research, what do you think was USC's greatest performances in bowl game competition? Do any games really stand out in your mind as being USC at its absolute best?
Yeah, I would say the 2005 Orange Bowl, whenever they beat Oklahoma. Now, obviously, those results have been vacated because of the Reggie Bush scandal, but that if you just go off the football itself, that was as good of a team as there's really ever been at USC. And I was looking at a college football book today where they were ranked number 2 all time, the 2004 USC team. And obviously, the whole Reggie Bush scandal has affected that. But yeah, they had some pretty good runs in the 70s. I'm thinking 1978 or 1979. I'm not sure off the top of my head when Charles White was there and winning the Heisman Trophy. That was also a very good time for the USC program. Charles White was just an unbelievable back.
Do you think that 73 annihilation of Ohio State where they beat them 42-17, was it 42-17 or 42-21?
Yeah.
Do you think that ranks up there? Because I remember watching that as a kid. That was the very first Rose Bowl game I watched that I was conscious of it, that, yeah, this is the Rose Bowl and this is something big and all that. And, of course, you had Anthony Davis and Pat Hayden and all that. Do you think that ranks up there too?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think it was Sam Cunningham, the fullback, who scored 4 touchdowns. Scored 4 touchdowns. Yeah, and so that was definitely another great team. I mean, there's so many; it's hard to choose from, certainly, and it's a little harder for me because I'm too young to remember most of those games or have even been alive for most of those games. And but yeah, definitely USC has had some amazing teams in its history.
Get it back. What authors, as you were growing up, what authors influenced and inspired you to become a writer, or perhaps influenced your own personal writing style? Do any come to mind?
The only one who comes to mind, this sounds crazy, but it would be Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is the one who encouraged me to start writing. We used to do Shakespeare plays at high school, and we'd have to act them out. And I just became so fond of Shakespeare that I wanted to write my own plays, and I was always writing stuff, and that's what ended up influencing me the most, because a lot of the books I read aren't by a single author. I read, encyclopedias and, reference books, so I'm not getting a certain author's perspective. But it's kind of weird how that worked out, but if there's anyone I'd point to, I'd have to point to Shakespeare, and that sounds ridiculous, but it is true.
Oh, it's not ridiculous at all. Shakespeare literally created English as we know it. What's your favorite Shakespearean play? Mine is The Tempest. What's yours?
Julius Caesar. We had so much fun acting that out in high school. Everyone had a character who they played, and we went beyond the classroom acting out stuff. There's never been a school-related thing, I think, my friends enjoyed more than that. So yeah, Julius Caesar was definitely all-time favorite.
Were you Caesar or Brutus or Cassius or Antony?
No, I was the guy who I don't remember his name. I was the guy who gave the big long speech in front of Caesar before stabbing him. So that's who I was. I forget his name.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 I'll tell you, in that movie, Antony and Cleopatra, I always enjoyed watching the movie up to the moment Caesar dies, and after that I switched the channel because I always loved Rex Harrison's portrayal of Caesar. Seriously, really. I mean, I thought he really captured him. I mean, do you think he captured him? What do you think? Yeah.
Actually, I haven't seen that one. So.
You've never seen that? Oh my goodness! Yeah,
no.
Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton as Antony, and Rex Harrison. You actually got an Oscar nomination for that, Harrison as Caesar.
Yeah. I'm not a very big movie watcher, so I've never seen that.
Tommy, where can readers purchase your books?
You can go to TommyAPhillips.com or nifty90s.com, and you can find all my books there. You can also search me on Amazon, Tommy A. Phillips, or Nifty 90s, or any of the titles of my books. You can find them there. They're all on Amazon exclusively, and that's where to find me.
Tommy, out of curiosity, it's safe to presume, I think looking up your books on Amazon, it's accurate to say all four were self-published. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's all self-published. I have tried to get self-published. I haven't been successful yet, but I do it for the joy of writing. So as long as people are reading, I don't care whether I'm being self-published or officially published.
Well, that's the reason why I ask is that I myself have availed myself of self-publishing my second and my third books, The Art of the Dealers and, of course, Lords of the Gridiron. So, in a sense, that's why I wanted to have you on, because I can relate, to your own I can relate to your situation, because, I was kind of curious because, like, with my third book, I could have gotten a conventional publishing deal, but they really wanted me to cut the final manuscript down. I would have left most of the best bits on the cutting room floor. I was kind of curious, or did you have similar experiences with conventional publishing firms? I mean, did you have possibilities and they told you to, literally rape and gut your manuscript, or no, you didn't delve into that?
No, that was exactly what happened. Yeah, that was exactly what happened. Basically, whenever I showed it to them, they were like, this needs to be about 1/4 of the size that you've made it, so there's no way this is ever going to work. So I was like, well, I have a choice. I can, either cut it down and make it something that I don't want it to be, or I can make it what I want it to be. And I was like, I'll just go into self-publishing, and that way people can see what I wanted to get out there, and they could see my work instead of seeing something that's really chopped down.
I'm curious, with Packers versus 49ers and then Tribute to Troy, were you able to reach out to Packers or Niners or USC Trojan players, and get direct interviews? Were you successful in that? Did you try for that?
No, I didn't try for that. For me, I have actually tried contacting athletes before. I've never been successful, but not for those books in particular. I had thought about working on another book where I was hoping to interview some people, but never was able to get a hold of anyone. So as of the moment, I have not done any interviews, but I hope to do some in the future.
Tommy, what is your next book project, and when may we expect its release?
Okay, I'm working on a prequel to the Nifty 90s. It's going to be called Great 80s, and it's going to be the same thing as the 90s, except all about the 80s. So it's going to be pretty much everything from the Nifty 90s book, but about the 80s, and it is going to be huge. And I hope to release it sometime this spring.
Well, Tommy, I know you wrote another book, Sundays at the Masters, but guess what, Tommy? I wanted to talk about that. Like on Tuesday, April 7th, that's the first Tuesday before the Masters tournament. I want to have you back on for that Tuesday night, and I want to talk to you solely about that book. Okay, your research into that, and it's a perfect tie-in for the Masters tournament. Was that okay for you, Tommy?
Oh, that's great.
Okay. Well, Tommy, I want to thank you so much for being on my show, and I look forward to talking to you again, on April 7th when we talk about your book, Sundays at the Masters, From Jack to Tiger, and then we'll talk about the upcoming Masters tournament. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show where I will be interviewing counselor, speaker, and podcaster Chris Godnese about her views on the American psychological landscape. Thank you and good night.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.